New set, new region, new day for War Room? No, it's just a little bit late. I tried to get it on Monday. Some days it'll be Tuesdays. Anyway, we're going to be looking at as many tournaments as we can from the opening weekend, and while most of what we're looking at is going to be coming from the Online League Series, we're also going to take a little bit of a look at Fight Night simply because there's a whole new region. There are so many different decks that could be out there. While it is totally different meta, what we're looking at right now is just kind of any data that we can get from the opening weekend. Maybe this is a list that could pop up in a 3-deck tournament. I don't think it'd be fair to say that anything that was played in Fight Night is like strictly a 2-deck format list, so we're looking at everything. So I want to get this one out of the way because it's, not as interesting as all the cool new Shurima stuff, but I did want to talk about Shenfiora, which has had a pretty big resurgence. Now, we're not seeing a lot of differences from what we saw in the previous meta. Players are actually still playing more Spirit's Refuge than Riposte, despite going down on copies of both of them, and everybody is trying out the brand new card Golden Aegis. This card gets a lot done because the barrier on top of the rally is so impactful. I mean, we see 3 Golden Aegis in a lot of Shenfiora lists. When was the last time you saw 3 Relentless Pursuit in a Shenfiora list? Being able to get that barrier on top of it is so impactful. And Shenfiora, which I already felt like was in a really good position, just got even stronger, albeit potentially even more inconsistent, which was the original problem with the deck. But the difference between something like Golden Aegis and Relentless Pursuit is that you don't feel bad about Golden Aegising with only 1 unit if that's what you have to do. I mean, Golden Aegis with a River Shaper just says draw a different spell and, put 2 damage on something, and that's so much better than Relentless Pursuit. I cannot understate how much this has done for the deck. And yeah, that's what Shenfiora is looking like right now. And very importantly, you see that Nopify going down to 1. Because Golden Aegis is 4 mana, you can't Nopify it, and that's going to be really relevant later on because while it's not super popular on ladder right now, Zoe Lee Sin is still a very popular tournament deck. Regardless of how you feel about concurrent timelines and whether or not the card should have ever been printed, that's a conversation for some other time that you're not going to have with me. I'm here to tell you that concurrent timelines Ladros is probably here to stay, and it actually won 2 of the 3 tournaments that I'm really gathering data from here. Won the Online League Series, and it also won Europe's Fight Night. And it's probably just the best Kindred deck. There's a couple of other Kindred decks that I'll go over as we get on here, but I do think that this is probably the best one and the most likely to continue to run Kindred. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a Shadow Isle PNZ control deck. It didn't really get as many tools as something like Freljord Shadow Isle did to continue to deal with something like Twisted Fate Fizz, but Kindred actually does a lot of heavy lifting in a matchup like that, especially when you pair it with something like the box. And, something like TF Fizz doesn't actually have a way to stop the Ladros combo, and I think that's one of the reasons we're going to continue to see this deck for tournaments, is because one of the most popular decks in the meta really doesn't handle something like this particularly well. Now, I would probably like to see Vi come back into this deck, because as I had mentioned, Vi was something that was doing a lot of work against the Twisted Fate Fizz list, specifically for the PNZ Shadow Isle control decks, and it's possible that Kindred replaces that entirely, and you don't really want to be playing 2 5-mana champions. It's a totally possible and reasonable sentiment. I just don't know if Kindred is specifically better than Vi for something like that, but only time will tell, and that's only in the 1 matchup. We are still a couple weeks away from getting any kind of balance change if they stick to their normal schedule. 2.4 or whatever patch is coming up should just be, a bug fix patch, and then 2 weeks after that we should actually be getting our first balance patch. So don't expect too much to change in the next 3 weeks meta-wise, aside from all the new stuff coming up. But my point is, this deck is good. It won 2 tournaments. It will probably win another tournament next weekend, and say what you want about it and talk about how easy the combo is to answer. The fact remains that there are decks in the meta that are very, very good, especially for tournaments, that do not answer the combo particularly well. And while I have us on the topic of Kindred, I might as well stick with it. This is a top 8 list from the Online League Series from What Am I? A Kindred Go Hard deck. And I think a lot of players that were looking at Go Hard coming into Empires of the Ascended were thinking about Kindred, and this deck looks a lot different from the Go Hard decks of old. There's no Burblefish in here. We went a lot more all in on the self-sacrifice package because Cursed Keeper is not something that is unheard of in Go Hard. It's something that actually had a really popular surge during like the 2nd or 3rd iteration of the initial Go Hard lists back when we were still calling this back alley poker. Just because of like Fortune Croaker can kill your Cursed Keeper, you can glimpse beyond it. It kind of helped with the fearsome matchup. I think a list like this might be a little bit too all in on the self-sacrifice package that doesn't really synergize with the identity that Go Hard is trying to do. This is like really far away from its control-y roots and more all in on just let's try and get our Kindred to pop off. I think this list is a little awkward, but I do think it is a good starting point, and I'm curious to see if Kindred is what it's going to take to put Go Hard back on the map. I'm not optimistic about it, though. So Nasus is also sometimes a Kindred deck, sometimes a Thresh deck. A lot of players are really figuring this one out. Right at the moment, there are two builds. There's Kindred Nasus, which usually looks a lot more like an Endure Spiders deck, and then there's Thresh Nasus, which looks a little bit more control-y. We put in a little bit more top end, a little bit more removal, but I'm a big fan of these decks. I think that the Rite of Negation and Atrocity on a spell-shielded unit is awesome. I love a lot of the things that they're doing. I'm not sure how long this deck is going to stick around. So far, its week 1 performances have been kind of mediocre, and I'm not sure how much more solved a list like this is going to be without looking totally different. And part of it could just be that players need to try and streamline the lists. Are we a control deck? Are we an Endure Spider deck? Let's pick one and stick to it. So I'm really going to be looking out for this one going into week 2 and potentially even week 3, but I think that if it doesn't get fixed soon, like within the next 2 weeks, then it's just kind of a dead archetype, and it was something that was cool and fun to experiment with in the first week, but ultimately just falls short of what it needs to be competitive. So really looking forward to continuing to track this one, because as I mentioned, I didn't think I was going to like Nasus on release, but I've actually really liked this style of deck, so, fingers crossed that I get to see a little bit more of it, because I enjoy casting it, I enjoy playing it. The self-sacrifice package, again, just a little bit more awkward. I don't think players are really honed in on what it looks like to have a functioning deck that runs all this kind of stuff between, having to play these little shitters like the Hapless Aristocrat and the Warden's Prey versus all the cool payoff cards, and things can get really clunky really quickly. And this is like a day 1 list. Even the day 2 lists looked really different from this, a couple more of the Baccae cards. But yeah, this is one that I wanted you to be aware of. You've probably seen this on Ladder, but I really like this archetype. I think it's solid, and I think that the community can find something here. I'm optimistic for it, at least. And I do think, for what it's worth, I do think that the Thresh is a little bit better than the Kindred here. I just don't think I think the Kindred's a little bit too win more in a situation like this. While I am aware of the existence of Sivir LeBlanc, it didn't actually put up really any results here in week 1, and I think that the Lucian Azir deck, came out really strong out of the gate in like day 1, day 2, day 3, and ever since then, like Monday, Tuesday, LeBlanc Sivir seems to have really taken over on Ladder, and I would expect that to translate into the weekend as players have started to figure out what their aggro lists look like. And at the end of the day, the more I look at Lucian Azir, the more it feels like a Lucian deck. And what I mean by that is, for the most part, every time a new set drops, people look at Lucian again. We make our day 1 Lucian deck. It's very high rolly. It's not that consistent. It's one of the best decks of week 1, and then by week 3, it's just completely off the map. Think about Lucian Hecarim, think about Lucian Scouts. Every time we see a Lucian deck come in, it has the same problems as every other Lucian deck before it. It has these high roll ephemeral combos, and that's about it. So I'm really not optimistic for the future of Lucian Azir. Maybe when the Cataclysm bug gets fixed, it'll be a little bit different, but I'm not even convinced if Lucian is necessarily going to be the best option for a deck like that, although he probably will be, right? Because if you get to Cataclysm and you go in with these additional Sand Soldiers, and then, you're feeding into your Lucian, it all sounds really good in theory, but Lucian decks always do. I am really optimistic to see what Sivir LeBlanc does in week 2, because I've really liked the lists that I've seen on Ladder, but I don't have one here for you because it hasn't topped a tournament yet, at least not one of the ones that I saw. Maybe it topped Lorga, but because they haven't actually submitted their top 32 lists yet, and they get a change in between it, and I don't have the deck sheet, and 32 players for a 66-person event, that's half the tournament that we'd be looking at. That's not really good data. So I am curious to see what happens now this weekend with the return of Duels of Runeterra, or the Duels of Runeterra adjacent thing that Kuma is doing. So looking forward to that one. But as far as Lucian Azir, cool week 1, probably going to see it week 2. Fringe playability week 3, fall off the map week 4. That's my timeline. Now, Lysandra Trundle is probably the most consistent and best deck to come out of the opening weekend. It was really popular across every event, did really well in just about every event it was played in, and it's pretty straightforward. There have been a couple of differences, and as I broke down on Tournament Tactician, there were the 3 versions: the Draculorn Inquisitor, the Turbo version with Spectral Matron, and then the Revitalizing Roar version. I still haven't really been able to pin down which one I like the most. Draculorn Inquisitor does still seem to be the one that most players are leaning towards. Although, if this deck does continue to be popular, then you probably do want to go for a more turbo version in order to beat the mirror and start to pick on the Lysandra Trundle, but only time will tell how popular this deck actually is for us to be able to pick on it in a lineup, because right now, while it is popular week 1, I don't know how that's going to fare week 2, because Shadow Isle Freljord control decks don't tend to stick around too long unless they have these explosive automatic victories like Feel the Rush or War Mother's Call where I throw down a Tryndamere and I Battle Fury it and then I Atrocity you. This one is a little bit slower because you do have to wait until, at minimum turn 8 to be able to throw down an 8-drop and then something else. You can't even play 2 8-drops on turn 8 unless you trundled twice because you don't actually organically play any 8-drops in this deck, but I'm optimistic for it. I think that a lot of the control tools that we got are really cool. Ice Shard actually does a lot of work against things like Twisted Fate Fizz and stopping all those Burblefish decks. Even something like Aphelios Bilgewater, probably going to have to reevaluate whether or not they're playing the Wiggly Burblefishes simply because of a deck like Lysandra Trundle. So it has come in, it has made its meta impact. I would expect it to continue to do so. As far as what the lists are going to look like going forward, only time will tell. I think that these week 1 lists are a lot different than what we're going to see in the future. I would not be surprised to see the more turbo-esque versions come out on top, and we even saw an Ionia version come pretty close to topping with Monastery of Hirana and using the Retreat Return to get in a 0-mana Watcher at burst speed, make sure that there's absolutely no counterplay to it. So we're looking forward to tracking this one, but this was definitely the breakout deck of the weekend. And then to close it out, I wanted to show something that the Hydra boys whipped up. I didn't talk about this with the Kindred list because this one was really just run by Team Hydra. I think it was Deech and Deriva were the ones that top aided with this, and Brazil always has some cool week 1 innovation. They were actually the ones that came up with Aphelios PNZ, or at least the ones that I saw playing Aphelios PNZ on the opening weekend, and I believe it was a member of Team Hydra and then a member of Team Sultans that did it, and then Sultans also ended up top 32ing the seasonal tournament with it with Macon Jackson. So I'm always trying to look out for what the Brazilian scene is whipping up coming into the opening weekend, and Kindred Swain is... it's not something that really grabs my attention day one just because, Pat even topped or I think won a tournament just before the seasonal tournament with Swain Elise, and like Swain Shadow Isle has just never really been my cup of tea, but there are a lot of cool new tools in here. Kindred, of course, doing double duty, letting you get those +1s in what is otherwise usually a pretty advantage neutral deck, and of course, any deck running 3 copies of Whispered Words, I'm going to be a big fan of, but I'm curious to see if this one picks up, how much it picks up, how quickly it picks up, because I don't know if this is the best Kindred deck, and I don't know if you really want to be running this outside of doing like a 3 Shadow Isle lineup where you're like, oh, I really want to play my Nasus deck, and then I'm putting Thresh in there, and then I want to play Lysandra Trundle. But even then, Kindred Concurrent Timelines does seem like the more consistent option than Kindred Swain, but I know that there's still a lot of mixed reviews on Concurrent Timelines Ladros and how easy the combo is to, sort of settle on. So while Timelines Ladros I had mentioned earlier, Twisted Fate Fizz doesn't have an answer for the Dreadway. If you are expecting other people to be running triple Shadow Isle lineups, then yeah, if your Ladros gets Vengeanced, that's a problem for you because it's actually a Dreadway and it's worse than if you had just kept it a normal Ladros. We might even get to a point where the way to play the Shadow Isle mirror if you're playing Concurrent Timelines Ladros is to just not play the Concurrent Timelines and, try to go for a normal Ladros victory. But that's a conversation for another time. For now, what I just wanted to mention was that, like, this deck exists. It's pretty cool. I'm expecting it to be refined a little bit more, but I don't know if it's really going to get its legs up. I don't like the look of this as much as I liked the look of something like the Aphelios PNZ, and part of that could just be because while Kindred is good, Aphelios is just more broken. That doesn't feel like a controversial statement, so pretty much any Aphelios deck that we saw week 1 I was going to be happy with. The Kindred decks I'm a little bit more picky on. Once again, the Fading Icon in here, this like self-sacrificing package. We didn't all in. We're not running anything like the 4-1 that sacks a guy to draw 2 cards, so we are a little bit more reserved in that regard, and I do like that. So going to keep a close eye on this one. Even if nobody else is watching this, I will keep you guys updated on how this Swain Kindred deck turns out in the meta, because I do think it's really interesting to look out for, and if this is Kindred's home in a triple Shadow Isle lineup, I can accept that. That's cool. And that is going to do it for me here on Tournament War Room, keeping you up to date on the meta in case you had a busy weekend and didn't get to catch any Legends of Runeterra tournament action. That's it. I don't have any outro thing. Duels of Runeterra is happening again this weekend. I'll have the sign-up link for that in the description of my Tournament Tactician. That'll be coming on Friday, once I have a little bit more info from Fight Night and things like that. It's probably going to be a little bit later at night again because I just want to gather as much info from North America as possible, and those deck lists don't go live until pretty late in the day, so keep your eye out for that one. Probably going to come out a little bit later than you would expect, but it'll be there, I promise. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard. As always, good luck in your tournaments.